John, when you hear the Syrian government warning journalists not to go in to report on unsafe and turbulent conditions, when they're the ones who have created these conditions, I mean, it's one of the many galling things that they have said over the last 12 months.
It is. I mean, you can understand a government doesn't want independent reporters sneaking in and exposing precisely what you're saying and what they've been seeing. I remember back in Bosnia, we had many journalists who snuck into places behind the Serb lines. It is the only way to do it if we're not going to be able to get in there independently. And this is what makes this reporting, and what Marie gave her life for, and what Remy gave his life for, and Anthony Shadid, and all of the people who we've lost. It is to get to the truth, and it is so difficult in these circumstances.
And you now have a situation where a number of reporters who are there are asking for some sort of evacuation, somehow to get out, which is basically, I mean, a microcosm of what, there are civilians there who can't get food in and want some sort of humanitarian corridor.
It is one of these unbelievably hellish situations where, as you say, nobody can get in or out safely right now. The reporters are justifiably afraid. They do want to get out. They've been very brave getting there. And obviously the civilian population is trapped as well. Again, the same kind of things, this medieval kind of siege mentality that we saw in Sarajevo and Srebrenica and all those towns that are so evocative 20 years later. It was 20 years ago that we saw this in the Balkans, and it's being repeated in these small towns and cities around Syria.
You know, every time we talk to Marie Colvin, we talked to her a lot over the years in many different situations. You know, her voice was always so cool, and yet her words were so powerful. I mean, she was so determined to see the truth and to tell the world. She actually called us on the last day of her life, not because she wanted to be on TV, but because she was so desperate to get word out about what was happening.
Well, that is what defined her, and her voice and her persona was always urgent and determined and fierce. Emotional, but not emotional to drown out, you know, the reality of what was going on that she was reporting.
And I mean, you knew her as a friend. I never even met her, and yet I knew her as this voice in all these places because I talked to her so often. Fouad, and now you hear the Syrian government, you know, whether or not they directly targeted her and the other journalists who were there, and there's some indication they may have, but we frankly don't know. They have clearly, just by indiscriminately shelling, targeted countless numbers of people.
Well, it's important for Bashar al-Assad to turn the lights off. This is exactly what this regime is all about. And this man, we know he harks for his father's time. He harks for a time when the lights could be turned off. And people like Marie Colvin and others are a challenge to this. It's been said of this war, by the way, Anderson, this is the first YouTube war. We see everything. We see everything. And these brave people have even paid such a terrible price to even make us see deeper and further. And I think there is absolutely a great amount of tolerance in our world for this, because all the violence we've seen in Syria hasn't risen to the level where the world will come to the rescue of the people of Homs and to the rescue of the people of Zabadani and other Syrian towns.
And Fouad and Anderson, I really strongly believe that's because you need people like Marie Colvin and Arwa Damon and all of the people who go in there to humanize these endless hours of very brave YouTube videos.
Well, the YouTube video is not enough.
It's not enough. You need the human story. You need the face to the numbers. You need the emotions of the people. You need to hear what they're going through under siege, and that's what Marie and everybody gave.
But I mean, I remember you in Bosnia, and you know, I would occasionally go to Bosnia, and over the course of that war in Sarajevo, I found people getting angry in Sarajevo toward reporters saying, you know what, how many deaths do you need to see? How many deaths do you need to take pictures of before somebody out there starts to do something?
Well, and rightly so, because we did chronicle their story every single day. And by the way, at that time, American networks had a much higher appetite for international news. We got our stories on every night on American television.
There's very few places actually telling the story of what is happening in Syria right now, especially on broadcast networks.
Well, that's true. I mean, trying to do our best, but you're absolutely right. That is true, and it is a very scary situation, and Marie's death has just had a chilling effect, you can imagine. And in Syria, you know, there is no appetite to intervene, and we're being told by the politicians and by the world leaders that it is difficult, it is not like Libya. You know, in Bosnia we heard this is a terrible civil war, all sides are equally guilty. People didn't want to do anything until they were forced to do it. And it's going to be interesting to see in this Friends of the Syrian People meeting that's happening in Tunis Friday, Secretary of State, 70 other countries and organizations, what they will come out with there.
How significant do you think that is, Fouad?
Well, look, I think there is, if you will, a battle of wills between the friends of Syria, the United States, France, the European powers, the Arab powers, and then what I call, obviously, the friends of the Syrian regime. And that's basically Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, that's a very important ally from Beirut, and lately joined by none other than Hugo Chavez, who's now sending supplies and fuel to the embattled Syrian regime. If I were a gambling man, I would bet my money on the friends of the Syrian regime rather than on the friends of Syria. The friends of Syria are nothing. The friends of Syria are just running the clock. We talked a couple of nights ago, and I said something to you, Anderson, about even on that Sarajevo clock, there is still 18 more months to be run. There's 18 more months to be run. The Syrian violence is now a year old, but as we both have, as all three of us were talking about Bosnia, we know it took 3.5 years before the cavalry came to the rescue.
Correct, but it took much less time to bring in humanitarian aid, and this, I think, is going to be the crux of what happens tomorrow, because the only thing that they can do now is try to put some ultimatum to President Assad. I've heard give him 72 hours or something to cease fire, or else put on more heavy sanctions, but to try to bring in humanitarian aid. But that, as we all know, requires armed escorts. Humanitarian aid doesn't just drive in with soft-skinned vehicles and civilians, certainly not in war zones. So that's going to be very interesting to see. But I would disagree with you. You know, you say the friends of the Syrian people are nothing and nobody. The friends of the Syrian people are the United States of America, the world's only superpower. You know, they have to be able to come up with something to affect the situation on the ground. The problem, of course, is that the opposition is splintered. We don't exactly know who we would give, who the US or the Allies would give weapons to, and how to do it. So unless there's an area where the West or Turkey or whoever, a combination, will carve out as a safe zone.
Some have talked about Turkey carving out some sort of a safe zone up north that the Turkish military would somehow defend. I don't know if that's how...
Look, the Turks are ready to help, and the Turks have drawn their line. What the Turks have said, they will not allow massive influx of refugees from Syria. They've told Bashar what the rules of the game are all about. They will not allow massacres close to them. The Turks need American leadership. And already, if we're talking about this Friends of Syria meeting, it's going to be several hours in Tunisia. And the Tunisians themselves said they precluded a decision on their soil that any help, any military help, would come to the Syrian people.
Kresna Amanpour, it's great to have you on our air.
It's great
to
be
have you
back.
All right, Fouad Ajami, thank you.
Thank you very much.